Water is pretty key to our understanding of people everywhere. From the fertile banks of the Nile to the mystical rivers of Heru, river basins shape histories and fantasies alike. And that's what I want to talk about today. River basins, their people, and how you can use historical inspiration to build great fantasy worlds. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. Man, my hair is too long for this shit. How I always pick the worst weather for these outside shots, I don't know. Anyway, so let's first talk about what a river basin actually is. A river basin is the entire land area where rainfall and surface water drains into a single river system. Okay? Think of it as like a giant bowl, like your wash basin, where every piece of water that lands on the rim eventually drains into the river itself. Now, to properly understand this, we do need to understand kind of the elements of a river. So let's just start with the source of a river. The source of the river is where it comes from, and it's typically found in the highlands, the mountains, glaciers, or other elevated parts. These areas receive precipitation in the form of rain or snow or glacial meltwater or anything else, and then gravity pulls the water downhill, forming trickles and streams. Water naturally flows from high to low points, as I said in my video about creating maps, which you can check out in the information cards. So mountains act like natural water towers that kind of collect the feeding waters and then lets it flow down into the valleys below. But within a river basin, you can actually have multiple rivers because you can also have tributary rivers. So tributaries form when smaller streams and brooks or creeks gather runoff from some of the valleys and hills and rainfall catchments, and they merge these into larger streams, which eventually feeds the main river. And this happens because the land's topography and rainfall distribution create a dendritic or tree branching network. So where there are multiple valleys, slopes, or uneven terrain, water finds multiple pathways converging towards the main river. The more kind of broken up your landscape is, the more likely it has that you have tributaries, and if there's larger valleys, some of those tributaries will gather into bigger rivers. Okay, so we have our source and we have tributaries, but when a river starts getting really big, it does what we call the meander, which is basically where it does this whole like curvy S-shaped thing. And that's formed by erosion and deposition of soil. As water flows through flatter land, it erodes the outer bank of the curves where the current is faster and deposits sediment on the inner bank, which causes the water to slow. And in flat plains, water basically seeks the path of least resistance. So slight obstacles cause the river to deviate, and once the curve starts, the centrifugal force increases the erosion on the outer edge, amplifying the bend over time. So once it starts curving, the curve gets bigger and bigger and bigger. These meanders are great because they create little oxbow lakes, which is something I spoke about in my video on lakes, which you can check out in the information card. But oxbow lakes are awesome. Okay, so we've got our flow down, we have our peaceful meandering coming out, and then finally we have the mouth of the river emptying out into an estuary or delta or mangrove swamp, as I spoke about in that video. So a river mouth basically forms where the river meets a larger body of water, generally speaking the ocean or a large inland sea or whatever it's emptying out into. Now, as the river speed slows as it's heading towards the ocean, It drops sediment, creating these deltas or estuary or tidal flats or mangrove swamps. So deltas will form in areas with low tides and weak waves, allowing sediment to build outward, for example, the Nile Delta. Estuaries happen where strong tidal forces mix with salt and fresh water, creating nutrient-rich ecosystems, for example, the Thames estuary. So in a world where you have, for example, 2 moons and very strong tidal forces, you're unlikely to get deltas, but you are very likely to get estuaries. So the last thing we need to talk about before we get to river basin civilizations is the watershed line or the drainage divide. This is basically the ridge or the highest ground that separates one river basin from another. Essentially, rainfall from one side flows into River A, while rainfall from the other side of the watershed flows into River B, whether it's tributary or through tributaries or whatever, right? So watershed lines often follow mountain ranges, highlands, or subtle ridges, but basically the highest point. And they define natural boundaries between regions, ecosystems, and sometimes even nations. And a nation on one side of a watershed can be in much better position than the nation on a different side of the watershed. Okay, so that's all the kind of physical aspects of a river basin. But that's just the geographical stuff. So, for our next trick, let's talk about the people. We're going to start with the Nile River, or the gift of predictable floods. So the Nile's regular, predictable flooding was the foundation of the ancient Egyptian civilization. Every freaking year, the inundation brought fertile black silt, replenishing the narrow rainbow of farmland along the banks of the Nile. And this seasonal rhythm allowed the Egyptians to develop sophisticated agriculture, centralized irrigation, and surplus food production. And without surplus food production, you can't get large cities or labor specialization or the kind of stratified society that we think of in terms of civilization. So that the Nile's flooding and the river basin of the Nile created these ideal conditions for the people of Egypt to take advantage of to build their civilization. Now, the Nile is a particularly interesting flood basin because its geography dictated unity. It is this linear strip of fertile land confined between deserts, and the river means that you have settlements going up and down the river, but only within that strip of land, and this encourages cultural and political cohesion. And indeed, control of the Nile's flood cycle, which was a very regular thing, became a religious and political duty, and pharaohs claimed their divine mandate by claiming that they brought the river's blessing. Heck, even their calendar started with the annual flooding season. That is how regular the flooding season of the Nile was, and how important it was to the continuation of the Egyptian civilization. So in your world building, rivers with predictable patterns encourage early agricultural empires and religious political systems tied to the natural cycle. A god river that floods very much on time to create ideal agricultural solutions could be worshipped by people, whether it is actually sentient or not, and the rulers could be seen as mediators of the divine order because of their relationship with the river. Okay, so from Africa, let's move over to South America and talk about the Amazon. So unlike the Nile, the Amazon's basin, which is the biggest basin in the world, is a vast rainforest. And the heavy rainfall and the jungle made large-scale agriculture very difficult along the Amazon River. Instead of empires, the Amazon fostered diverse, localized societies that practiced slash and burn horticulture, floodplain farming called várzea, and terra preta soil enrichment. The dense jungle growth typical of the Amazon limited the expansion of centralized states, but the rivers and tributaries themselves were crucial highways for trade, travel, and cultural exchange. The Amazon's size meant that choke points could be controlled, and those choke points could be tolled, but the interior remained a mosaic of autonomous communities. This results in wealthy communities around the choke points, but does not encourage empire or centralized state formation. Now, those rich communities on those choke points might be what fueled the large structures that we've recently found in the Amazon jungles, but they would have been wealthy in their place rather than spreading out and conquering others. Basically, the tolls that they extracted for getting through their river choke points would make them rich rather than conquest and tribute making them rich. So, in your world, if you have river basins with dense natural barriers like jungles or swamps, this would be more likely to foster fragmented polities, isolated cultures, and a network of river-based alliances and rivalries. This is great for decentralized fantasy regions and enclaves with secretive river folks. All right, now let's move back and talk about the Indus River Basin, or the engine of civilization and conflict. The Indus River Valley nurtured one of humanity's earliest urban cultures, the Harappan civilization from 3,300 to 1,300 BCE. Its irrigated agriculture, centered on wheat, barley, and cotton, supported large planned cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. The basin's alluvial plains made farming possible in an otherwise very arid region, but not a desert, which is important, we'll get to that. Its geography encouraged urban clusters, but they didn't seem to create centralized kingdoms like Egypt. The settlements were more dispersed. And it is worth talking about why. Because the Indus didn't have jungles like the Amazon, so why didn't they centralize? First, we need to talk about the difference in geography between the Nile and the Indus. The Nile River flows, as I said, in this narrow corridor, right, with desert on either side of it, and it's only got a slender strip of arable land on either side, for 5 to 20 kilometers wide. This geography funnels the population and power along a single axis, making it easier to unify politically. The Indus River, on the other hand, is part of a broad alluvial fan, spreading out across a wide region with multiple rivers. The Indus, the Ravi, the Bias, the Sotleze, the Chenab, the Jhelum, and other tributaries, and it all creates this vast stretches of cultivatable land. So settlements scattered across this wider, flatter plain, making centralized control harder. The second big difference is the river's actual behavior, which is predictable floods versus shifting waters. So the Nile has this very predictable annual flood. As I said, it rises gently, it retreats predictably, and it makes irrigation and agriculture reliable. But the Indus does not behave in this way. The Indus and its tributary were prone to unpredictable shifts, floods, and even course changes. The river's behavior was way more volatile, complicating your long-term infrastructure and centralized governments. And then our third big difference between the two is the ecology, which is the harsh desert as opposed to the semi-arid frontier. Now, You might think that the desert would make it harder to do agriculture, and yes, it does, but it also confines the population and makes expansion outward difficult, restricting you to this corridor. The Indus, on the other hand, is in a semi-arid region, and there's grasslands and even monsoon-influenced areas. So this environmental diversity encouraged self-sufficient urban centers rather than relying on the centralized control that you needed in the Nile. And then there's the cultural and trade networks, an internal focus versus an external pull. With the Nile, Egypt was somewhat geographically isolated, focusing inward and trading along its river corridor. But with the Indus, it had maritime trade with the Mesopotamians via the Arabian Sea, and it had overland links to Central Asia and the Iranian plateau, or the Persian plateau. This multi-directional connectivity fostered decentralized economic hubs rather than one capital, because they could trade with multiple external people from other river basins. And then lastly, it is just worth mentioning that we might be missing the plot. It is entirely possible that the Indus River had a centralized civilization or a soft centralized civilization, but we don't know, because unlike Egypt and Mesopotamia, we lack deciphered written records from the Indus Valley civilization. And this is for a variety of reasons, but possibly just because their records didn't preserve as well because they have a much wetter climate versus the bone-dry conditions of the desert that really preserved so much of our archaeological evidence. And they didn't seem to be the sort of monument builders that the Egyptians were. So without those monuments and without deciphered records, it's really hard to say if we're just missing something and maybe they were a centralized civilization. Okay, so our TLDR for why Indus did not turn into the same centralized kingdom as Egypt. First, the geography was different. We have the narrow corridor versus the broad floodplain. Second, we have the flooding behavior. The Nile was very predictable, whereas the Indus Valley was very unpredictable and had shifting rivers. Then we had the ecology. The desert hems in outward expansion, while the open frontier of the Indus allowed these micro civilizations. Then we have the trade focus difference, where the Nile focuses trade up and down, but the Indus Valley had a diverse spread of trade. So those are all the reasons why the Indus River didn't develop this centralized location. However, there is another river which had a very unpredictable pattern and still resulted in a centralized state. So let's talk about the Yellow River, known as China's Sorrow. So the Yellow River is famed for its silt-heavy waters and catastrophic floods. But yet, it was the birthplace of the Chinese civilization and a strong centralized state. It nurtured early dynasties like the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou through floodplain agriculture of millet and wheat. The river's loose, rich soils are incredibly fertile, but its tendency to change course and breach levees made controlling it a constant struggle. Massive hydraulic engineering projects like dikes, canals, and levees became a hallmark of Chinese statecraft. Politically, the ability to control or the failure to manage the river was seen as a measure of a dynasty's legitimacy, their mandate of heaven. So this all sounds like it shouldn't encourage centralization, right? After all, it's chaotic, it's spread out, and there's plenty of trade opportunities. But centralization did result. So let's talk about why. First, once again, we have some geographical differences. There is a natural core region with the Yellow River. The North China Plain, fed by the Yellow River, is broad, but it is naturally boxed in. It has the Taiyang Mountains to the west, the Yangtze Mountains to the north, and the Yellow Sea to the east. And southward lay the Hawaii River system, but that was also flood prone. So this created a kind of self-contained fertile core where most settlements clustered within the basin. Unlike the Indus, with the vast open plains leading into deserts and frontiers, China's heartland had firmer boundaries. Okay, second, we come to floods as a unifying problem. The Yellow River's floods were so catastrophic, hence the nickname China's Sorrow, that dealing with them required lots of labor, lots of people working together in conjunction to contain the floods of the river. And early Chinese rulers justified their authority by their ability to engineer and maintain solutions to the river's flooding. Their ability to tame the river. For example, Yu the Great, the founder of the Zhai dynasty. So over time, this engineering imperative fostered the development of a centralized government capable of organizing large populations for the hydraulic projects. In essence, there was so much chaos, it needed large organized groups to deal with it. Hey, at least the sun's come out. Then our third reason for this organization is because it was so very fertile. The Yellow River carried an immense load of lewis, which is fine wind-blown silt, making the floodplain extremely fertile. Unlike Egypt's predictable Nile, the Yellow River fertility came with unpredictability, but the rewards were massive. And this combination of high risk, high reward agriculture made controlling this land strategically vital. And this incentivized warfare. Of course it did. And warfare incentivizes state formation to secure and protect arable land. The first goal of the state is property rights. Then our fourth reason is tributary rivers and transport connectivity. The Yellow River had significant tributaries, like the Wei River, which became secondary power centers. The river's upper reaches near modern Xi'an or ancient Chang'an and Luoyang became focal points for early dynasties. Despite its shallows and its course changes, sections of the Yellow River and its tributaries enabled regional trade and troop movement, fostering integrated polities who basically paid tribute to the centralized state. So you had these centralized states that were sort of federated under the empire. And all of this eventually led to the cultural ideology of the mandate of heaven. So the disasters of the Yellow River were interpreted not just as natural events, but signs of cosmic imbalance. And the early Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven linked a ruler's legitimacy to their ability to maintain harmony, including controlling the floods. This theological political concept reinforced central authority because whenever the floods were too severe, it was seen as a sign that it's time to replace the ruling dynasty. Okay, so what is our long and the short of it of why the Yellow River did result in centralization? First, we have the geographic boundary. So we had the Nile, which created the corridor. We had the Indus River, which spread out we have the jungle of the Amazon basin, and then we have the box structure of the Yellow River. Then there's the unpredictable level of flooding resulting in massive organization requirement. Then we have the high fertility, high risk agriculture. And finally, the tributary connectivity river network of the Yellow River enabled decentralized centralization, where you have kingdoms paying tribute to an emperor. As a world builder, when you are building your river basin and you're building the civilizations that result from it, consider the following topics. First, what kind of flood patterns are you looking at? Is it regular? Is it gentle? Is it violent? Does it change? Does it force adaptation? Or does it create regularity? How navigable is the river? Can it be used for trade, for transport, for military movement? Are there any choke points? Then consider your geographic barriers. Does the basin cut through a jungle? Does it have desert that hems it in? Are there mountains that create barriers? And how does that affect the cultural and political unity of your people? Consider resource distribution. Are there fertile floodplains or rare resources? Also remember here your magical sediments or your some kind of fantasy creatures. And then, what is culturally significant about the river? Is it considered sacred? Does it have spirits or deities or legends tied to it? How do these beliefs shape the societies? Also think about shared basins. Does the river cross borders? Is water sharing a cause for diplomacy and conflict? And think about, as we do with China, who builds and maintains levees, dams, or their magical equivalents. How is that tied to power and legitimacy? So this episode is brought to you by my members, and indeed they voted to see this episode. I put a couple of episodes before them to vote for it. They voted and they chose river basins and civilizations. So if you would like to also have a lot of input into the episodes that I produce, and you would like early access to my videos and a bunch of other cool perks on screen right now, you can join the channel for as little as a cup of coffee a month. Hit the join button down below, and I will hopefully see you in the members only area. And now, let's talk about rivers in fantasy worlds. So the river that I want to discuss as a fantasy example is the rivers of Hyrule in the Legend of Zelda. In the Legend of Zelda, rivers are far from just being set dressing. They are living, functional parts of the world's geography, the gameplay, and the mythos of Zelda. Rivers often serve as natural boundaries, delineating different regions. For example, Zora's River separates central Hyrule from the domain of the aquatic Zora people. And crossing rivers in the game frequently marks a transition to a new biome, challenge, or storyline, mirroring how rivers historically defined cultural and political frontiers. Rivers also guide players towards objectives. Whether it's following a river upstream to reach the Zora's domain in Ocarina of Time, or rafting down whitewater rapids in Breath of the Wild, or solving water-themed puzzles, rivers are both obstacles and avenues. They're not passive. They shape how players move through the world. But this is fantasy. Rivers are tied to sacred locations and divine entities. In Breath of the Wild, there are quests where water manipulation is key to restoring balance, and divine beasts directly influence rivers and rainfall. Water's role as a purifier and life giver is a recurring motif, deeply embedded in the world's narrative fabric. Zelda shows that rivers in a fantasy world should be interactive, influential elements. They shape not just the landscape, but the culture, mythology, and journey of the people who live alongside them. So let's talk about 3 different ways to use rivers in fantasy. 1. They are a habitat for fantasy species. Rivers are natural homes for fantastical beings, creatures like aquatic elves, nymphs, and merfolk. These can also have civilizations that dwell beneath the water's surface, often tied to the river ecology. These species might be allies or guardians controlling fish stocks, guiding boats, and enforcing river laws. Or you could have bigger solo creatures living in it, like river dragons or leviathans. These could be massive ancient creatures that sleep beneath riverbeds, occasionally rising to alter the river's course or defend it from invaders. Their presence could control trade routes or be the focus of river-centric religions. So, in your world, what lives in your rivers? Do you have any river basins with unique creatures? Consider how these creatures affect your human civilizations as well, and how they might have impacted the early river basin civilizations. Let me know in the comments below. The second potential for river is, of course, as an abode of spirits or gods. Many real-world cultures have revered rivers as living deities or ancestral spirits, a tradition that fantasy can elevate to reality. But you can have personified rivers, where it's not just water, it's a sentient being with moods, desires, and grudges. In times of drought, appeasing the river god might require festivals or offerings or sacred pilgrimages or quests. Or you could have a contractual magic system where people go to a river, make a contract with a spirit, and through that contract, they gain magical power. And breaking these contracts could lead to floods or droughts or supernatural retribution. And of course, that could also result in conflict between water spirits, where rival river gods whose tributaries meet cause this massive impact on the river basin. Do you have such a contract magic system? Do you have spirits that live in your river? Would it make sense in your world to do that? Or, if they're not real, is there places in your world that people believe there to be spirits living in the river? It can go either way. Let me know in the comments below. Thirdly, your river can be a source of magic. It can be a natural conduit of power. You could have ley lines of power running through the water itself, with the flow of the water, the kinetic energy, providing a means for mages to draw power from. Or it could be a source of elemental water magic, obviously as we see in Atla, the last avatar. You could have waterbenders or hydromancers, or even alchemical mages could work with river water. And then rivers could serve as a crossing place between realms. Some rivers could act as boundaries between worlds, the living and the dead, the mortal and the fey realms, or even timelines. Crossing the river could be a rite of passage for people, or it could just represent a perilous ordeal. How can rivers enter your world building? Can they make it easier for a mage to use magic? Can they provide additional power? Can they open a doorway into another world? River basins have been the cradle of civilizations and continues even today to influence modern geopolitics. In fantasy world building, they offer a versatile tool for creating immersive and dynamic settings. If you understand the real world significance of river basins, you can craft basins in your world that breathe life into your setting. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment down below. And thank you very much to all of my members, especially the just-in-timers of the Build It in Stone level: Neil Buckley, Lupex Lakeshire, Necromancer JM, Epic, Katie Kofi Mug, and Tony Lamanna. You guys make it possible for me to keep making these videos. If you'd like to support the channel, you don't have to spend any money, however. You could just watch another video, because that way the algorithm knows to love me. If you enjoyed this video, maybe check out my video on lakes in a fantasy world, which I'll put on the screen over there. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World Building.